want to know what it's fighting for. Podcast for George. 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 Oh, yeah.
Hello. Hi. How are you? Welcome back in to another podcast by George. Laura Bellin with Bleeding Heartland is back to talk about the Keystone Cops and state government. I mean, it seems like that at times with our governor's office. And I wanted to premise this a little bit by, again, giving my 2 cents when it comes to the CARES Act. People have heard me bitch about this. Now, George, how come you're so critical of that? Well, that thing came out in the spring of 2020. I mean, unanimous approval in the U.S. Congress. It came out. We went and protected the interests of Wall Street and the big businesses. $5 trillion, it's kind of estimated roughly, went right up the pipeline, straight to those companies. And at that time, there were statistics, I mean, consistent polling that said that, 80% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck in this country. 63% of Americans said they couldn't afford a $500 emergency in their households. Well, what's an emergency? How about a pandemic, for God's sake? And there was no proviso for that. I mean, there was a little bit of an unemployment provision in there. And then there was a call to provide money to state and local governments. And I went on the podcast. I said, oh, my God, I live in Iowa. For our folks that live here, maybe you live in Missouri, Arkansas, Mississippi, South Dakota, Nebraska, or something like that. Man, you're going to give money to those people? Well, you better watch it. Well, guess who's watching it? It's Laura Bellin with Bleeding Heartland, and she's got an exclusive just this week on what's happening with this money and the mixing of the paint and the lack of transparency. It's kind of in the weeds, as Laura says, but it bears to see the light of day, and that's what we want to do today. Laura, welcome back into another podcast by George.
Always good to be here, George. We've talked about the CARES Act before. A lot of good programs were funded through the CARES Act, but then there was a lot of waste. And I mean, there was tremendous discretion. In Iowa, the governor had almost complete control over how 1.4 billion was spent from it. So that was 1.25 billion rather. 1.4 billion is what's coming from the American Rescue Plan. But our legislature just hasn't exercised any oversight at all over what the governor's done with this money.
Well, and there was a call for that. I mean, there was there were people pleading for oversight, but again, because everybody is so hysterically paranoid, uptight about the levers of power in this country and Wall Street and these big corporations. I mean, it was forced through and went through very quickly, and it got through without these oversight provisions. And I think what you're revealing here is an outgrowth of that. I wanted to start off with this posting from this week and just read through a little bit of this and then have you pick it up because you wrote it, obviously. But it states exclusive. And again, one word, got to pay attention to that. Exclusive. When Laura wrote this, there wasn't anybody else reporting this, folks. Just Bleeding Heartland. The governor approved CARES Act spending on office tech upgrades. And it reads, Governor Kim Reynolds approved plans last year to spend federal COVID-19 relief funds to upgrade the technology in her conference room, state records show. Now, the Office of Chief Information Officer paid Vendor AVI Systems $67,543.48 in December for unspecified IT equipment and software and IT outside services. Published reports and searchable databases do not reveal that those purchases benefited the governor's office. But documents Bleeding Heartland obtained through public record requests indicate that the spending covered new audio and video equipment installed in the Robert Ray Conference Room, which is part of the governor's office suite. Okay, so Laura, records also show that payments were supposed to come out of Iowa's Coronavirus Relief Fund, a pot of federal money established under the March 2020 Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security CARES Act. And so that's why I kind of started off with that. But pick it up from there, because this took a lot of effort. I know just looking at this article, reading it, I could tell how hard this was to put together. I mean, this is what I call muckraking journalism. It really is.
Yeah, this involves several public records requests and hundreds. I mean, they sent hundreds and hundreds of individual PDF files. And so when you're going through those, most of them weren't directly related to what I was investigating. So it's quite time consuming. But I wanted to say, first of all, because a few people asked me about this after I published, they said, well, what's wrong with spending CARES Act money on technology upgrades? Because of course we needed to do a lot more things remotely last year. And I've investigated a lot of state agency spending in the CARES Act. And I mean, tens of millions of dollars have been spent on technology legitimately. I haven't written about it because it's understandable. They bought a lot of new computers for state government employees who were going to be working from home. The Office of Chief Information Officer spent a lot of money on a system that was like it's called Okta. It's a system that is user authentication when people log in remotely so that things are kept secure when government employees are working from home. These are all completely understandable expenses that are related to the pandemic. This particular conference room upgrade, which I was investigating, and also the one I reported on in March that we discussed on an earlier episode, which was converting the governor's office computers from Google Suite to Microsoft Office 365. Those are technology upgrades that are not directly related to the coronavirus pandemic. And the CARES Act was very specific that it had to be a necessary cost incurred due to the public health emergency. And what they put in supporting documentation for this conference room, they said, well, this will allow the governor to have remote COVID press conferences. Well, if you watched the governor last year, she did many press conferences. For the first few months, they were at the State Emergency Operations Center, and then they were primarily at Iowa Public Television Studios. And in fact, even after this technology upgrade in her office suite last December, she continued to have her COVID-19 press conferences at the Iowa PBS studio. So clearly, this technology upgrade in her office was not a necessary expenditure due to the public health emergency.
Well, I will say this, podcast by George isn't exactly high tech, but I mean, we get the job done. You can do Zoom news conferences on your phone, folks. I mean, I don't want to be overly critical. I mean, supposedly they need more technology than that. But I wanted to read this next paragraph because I don't know, maybe out of everything that you've written here, this is what really chaps my ass. Let me read this. The governor's spokesperson, Pat Garrett, ignored 6 inquiries over a 2-week period. Now, again, every word means something here. This is the governor's spokesperson ignoring inquiries over a 2-week period. It isn't like they had to respond the next day or within the next hour. No response for 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. OCIO's public information officer, Gloria Van Rees, also did not respond to 8 messages during the same time frame seeking to clarify what funding stream paid for the conference room upgrades and whether the governor's office reimbursed OCIO for the payments to AVI Systems as happened following the Office 365 migration. Well, one of the reasons this gets to me so much is that Gloria Van Rees is there. She's the public information officer. She's supposed to be providing public information to you and I, or, I'm talking to my audience here, but also Laura Bellin of Bleeding Heartland. And it takes this long to get a response.
Yes. And I mean, Gloria had at least been somewhat responsive earlier in the year. And then it reached a point where she said, if you have any further questions about this, you're going to have to submit another public records request. Well, I mean, I know that the public records request process takes weeks, if not months sometimes, to get the records back. And these were follow-up questions related to records I already had. So I really didn't feel that I should have to file a new public records request and go through that extensive delay. This was information that I had been provided by the agency. And then in some cases, I was able to dig it up on a different government website, this checkbook website. But Pat Garrett of the governor's office, I mean, he very rarely responds to anything. I send him questions every week, and I mean, it might be once every few months or something that I get an answer back. So he just isn't very responsive. But I mean, I always try to give them several opportunities to respond because I know that he is getting a lot of inquiries. So I never ambush them by sending them a message and then immediately publishing 2 hours later.
And your reporting, when I read into this and the way that this money moves around in the governor's office, I'm reminded of that street game. What is it with the 3 Ps or 3-card Monte or whatever it is, where they shuffle things around. I mean, there's a little bit of that going on here, wouldn't you say?
Well, this is a long-term trend in the governor's office where they push operating expenses onto other state agencies. So it has allowed the governor to expand her staff and pay them very well and without exceeding her budget allocation. So this is something OCIO in the past has, and OCIO does purchase some technology for other state agencies. But in this case, again, I think it's questionable that if the governor really felt that these technology needs in her office warranted using CARES Act money, she should have allocated CARES Act money directly to her office. But that's never once has the governor allocated CARES Act money to her office. When, as we discussed last fall, when she authorized using almost $450,000 to pay part of her permanent staff salaries. They ran that money through the Homeland Security Department, and then the Homeland Security Department made a transfer. So if you looked at the databases, it just looks like the Homeland Security Department got an allocation for state government COVID staffing, and it didn't say anything about the governor's office. So you would have to do like I did, you would have to file public records requests and to get at that information. So it's just not very transparent. But also, I mean, the governor, I think that something like the governor's office computers or the conference room, I think that's something that should come out of her office's operating budget and not something that another agency pays for.
And that's the mixing of the paint that I talked about, with this money all going into the same pool, and PP, who's got the P, where's the money at? I mean, honest to God. We talked about that on an earlier podcast, how her staff is not only expanding, but they're paid right at the top of the guidelines for state employees. And you look at that and you wonder, how is she able to do that? Well, this might be part of the reason.
Right. And I'm about to file another records request now that the fiscal year 2021 just ended on June 30th. So I'm going to be filing another request soon related to her staff salaries. But several people on the governor's office staff make more than the governor herself. And that has not always been the case in past administrations. I know in Chet Culver's office, for instance, I mean, he had a very experienced legal counsel who really could have commanded a higher salary, but there was a principle that nobody here is going to be paid more than the governor. Well, the governor this governor does not follow that principle. So she even had, as of last year, her deputy chief of staff, Paige Thorson, who's very young, I mean, maybe in her early 30s, she was getting paid more than the governor, not the chief of staff. I mean, the chief of staff was also getting paid more than the governor, but even the deputy chief of staff. So, it's really questionable. And then the position that Paul Trombino formerly held in the governor's office, and when he moved on to another agency, the governor hired somebody else, but this is called a chief operating officer. This was a brand new position that the governor created that nobody ever. Previous Iowa governors didn't have anything called a chief operating officer in their office. So I don't really know exactly why that position was necessary, but that's been a very well-paid position. So, I feel that the governor should be asking the legislature to appropriate more money to her office if she really feels that she can make a case that all of these staff members are necessary.
A lot of different angles on this one particular story, all very interesting. I don't know, there may be more than one bottom line, but when I look at it, to me, the bottom line might well be this lack of transparency that's coming out of Reynolds' office. And is this going to become the new normal? Laura, as I oftentimes mention, you've been the editor there at Bleeding Heartland since 2008. You've been doing this for many years. You've been doing this for decades. That is reporting on government. Have you seen anything like this? Is this trend going to continue? Do you think it's limited to this particular administration, or is this the new normal?
Well, the lack of transparency is really unusual. And I should say that when in the early years of Bleeding Heartland, I had much younger kids and I wasn't doing as much investigative reporting and public records requests and that sort of thing. I didn't have the time that I have now to devote to that. But I do know that when public records requests were filed, they were fulfilled. And even under Governor Branstad, I mean, when I filed public records requests at that office, which I did many times, I always got the records within, I think at most, maybe 2 months. And that was one where it really was a fairly expansive request that I had sent. So I never thought, maybe sometimes you could say that they slow walk the request, but I never felt that they were entirely non-responsive. And this governor's office, I mean, they're just not in compliance with the open records law. They haven't fulfilled. I have a records request outstanding from April of 2020. I actually counted them up this week. I have 10 records requests outstanding from over the past 16 months. And some of them were very targeted. A couple of them, you could argue, might take them a while to compile, but a couple of them were things that could have been done in a matter of minutes, really. So they probably already had the records ready to go. So they're just not in compliance with the law. So, and as for pushing operating costs onto other agencies, that has been done for some time, even Governor Vilsack, and I think that Governor Branstad, the first time he was around. Occasionally, when members of the governor's staff are doing a lot of work with a particular agency, it's not been unusual to have that agency's staff pay part of their salary. That is a longstanding practice, but this governor has expanded that. She's pushed more people's salaries onto other agencies, and in several cases, the agency has been paying 100% of the governor's staffer's salary, rather than just in the past, it might have been 35% or 60%. So it's she's definitely taken it to a new level, and it's very difficult to find out. Like I said, if you didn't file a public records request, you wouldn't be able to learn that any of this is happening. And in fact, it was because I've had this longstanding interest in how the governor is covering her operating budget that I even stumbled onto the fact that she was using CARES Act money for her staff salaries. Because way back last summer, the summer of 2020, I had requested copies of salary sharing agreements under which other state agencies would pay salaries of people in the governor's office. And when I had requested those in previous years, so I knew what the format typically was. And when I got the ones that had been signed in 2020, they all ran through like March 14th. And that made me think, well, why didn't they run through the end of the fiscal year? I wonder if she was using some COVID-19 funding stream to cover that. And so that led to more records requests. But again, that just happens to be, my particular interest in the governor's office budget. It's not something that you could find out by looking on a state salary database or looking on a state record of how much which agencies are spending.
My God, thank God that she's on the case, folks. Bleeding Heart. Now I'm going to bring up the URL, the web address for Bleeding Heartland. We'll mention that at the end. But this needs to be supported because this may be a trend. This may be the new normal. Normal administrations may change, but also in Iowa, you got to remember we tend to have governors for life. Now, I don't know how long Reynolds is going to be in office, but we remember Branstad, the earlier governor, for life. So we need to have somebody like Laura on the case. And as far as the bigger picture is concerned, I liken American politics a lot of times to pro wrestling, but anymore, it's getting so down and dirty. I think of it more like gang warfare almost. We have these warlords in charge of the political parties, and their primary mission is preservation of the gang, it seems like, as opposed to helping Americans. And we see this across both parties, but maybe one more than the other. And that brings me to the next topic that I wanted to cover, because it seems like we've got some gang members that kind of agree or disagree, and it has to do, again, CARES Act stuff is kind of involved in this, but it has to do with that ordering of the troopers down to the Texas border by the governor of Iowa that you reported on, and Iowa's 2 U.S. senators, Grassley and Ernst, are both kind of citing a lack of transparency in that, which was brought up in your reporting when it first occurred, or when you first learned of it anyway.
Yes, well, originally the governor just said that they didn't say when the deployment was happening or exactly how many troopers were going down there or where they would be or what they were doing. And the Department of Public Safety told me and others who asked that in order to protect the safety of the troopers, they weren't going to give out any operational details of the mission. So this week on Monday, the governor was at a joint press conference with the governors of Nebraska and South Dakota, and she did give out a few more details. She said that they had just gone down to Texas a couple of days earlier. She said generally what area of Texas they would be in. It wasn't that specific, but at least she gave a few more details. But I was surprised that Senator Ernst, who really is a close political ally of the governor, she did say in a conference call with reporters that she felt that we should have more information about exactly what the troopers are doing down there. Now, she did say she supported the mission, but it really is amazing when you think about it that the Department of Public Safety would claim that it's jeopardizing the troopers to even tell Iowans how their money is being spent. I mean, no one is, it clearly wasn't jeopardizing their safety because the governor felt comfortable revealing that information on Monday.
Well, I will say this, I'm not the world's deepest thinking scholar, but I can pick up a history book. And when I look at what the governor's doing with the state of Texas and these other states, I don't sounds strikingly similar to me to another part of American history around the 1860s. And then you've got the frightening element of borders being involved in all of that. When states band together to oppose the interests of the federal government, I don't know, Laura, that kind of creeps me out. That's scary stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, the partisanship that you mentioned a few minutes ago is really striking because this is the kind of thing where the governor really And even if some of the stuff that I reported on related to the CARES Act spending, I had Republicans tell me privately last year that, oh, in the old days, this is something that state legislators of both parties would have been upset about, and the lack of
Yeah.
transparency, and why is the governor spending this much money on her office staff salaries. But what we have now is these Republican legislators just don't want to ask any questions about how the money is being spent. And in terms of going to Texas, I mean, this is a talking point that Republicans are pushing, that we have this crisis at the border and we have to take action, and the Biden administration isn't doing enough about it. And so it's just using the state patrol as political props. And really, as we discussed on the last show, I don't think that the Iowa State Patrol should be on missions outside the state of Iowa. It's not really part of their normal scope of duties. And some other states are sending their state troopers, some are sending the National Guard. I mean, I question also sending the National Guard on this kind of mission at the request of another state, but at least that it's more in the mission of the National Guard to go and do work in outside of the state of Iowa, whereas the Iowa State Patrol just hasn't done that before. And the state Department of Public Safety keeps telling people, well, this is very similar to other short-term deployments like RAGBRAI and the Iowa State Fair, but it isn't, because those are large events in Iowa involving many thousands of Iowans.
Oh, God, time goes by fast. I just looked at my clock. When we talked to Laura, we're already running out of time. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to super these websites for Bleeding Heartland and have people, support the cause here. And I always mention that they're on Patreon, and donations are accepted there. These open meeting requests, these public record filings and all that stuff takes a little bit of money, folks. So you can help. You can be a part of this. I mean, if you like what Laura's doing, I know a lot of people that watch my show like this. Join her. I mean, be a part of this. And Laura, I guess I would just let you put a bow on it here. Wrap it up. Close out this particular edition.
Thanks. I mean, it really is a lot of work. I mean, it's expensive sometimes filing the records requests, and it's a lot of work going through them. I should also just say that my policy is not to accept contributions from Iowa elected officials or candidates or paid staff or consultants on Iowa campaigns. So those people should not contribute. But others who want to support the work and independent journalism, I mean, I do appreciate the reader contributions. They're very helpful to cover my operating costs and make sure that I can do things like when a state agency tries to charge me a few $100s for public records, I can do that.
God, that's great. Thanks again, Laura, not only for being on the podcast, but for all of this great work in journalism that you do.
Thank you, George.
And folks, if you like Podcast by George and sharing the platform with folks like Laura Bellin, please support us. Doesn't cost anything. The podcasts are all free. Just go to YouTube, subscribe, ring the notification bell, give us a thumbs up there, go to iTunes, leave us a comment, subscribe there. And of course, it's easy to follow along on Facebook because the podcasts appear on a lot of the political groups that are on that platform. But that's going to do it for this edition. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast. Bye, George.